Hi everyone, my name is Melanie Vincent. I'm part of the GPE 4700 2020 to 2021 class, and I'm very excited to share my thesis with you all, which is titled Comprehensive Land Claims as a Strategy of Limited Recognition. As a quick overview, in Canada today, the Crown is faced with an impossible contradiction. It must protect resource extraction and investment while also enacting decolonization in response to increased awareness and public outcry against colonial injustices. So the state has had to reconceptualize its relationship with Indigenous peoples to reflect this shift in public values. Part of the state solution was to allow Indigenous peoples to make what are called comprehensive land claims to regain their unceded territory. So my research explores the 2011 Maa-Nulth Final Agreement and how the CLC process filters Maa-Nulth assertions of rights through a seemingly progressive and legitimate legal framework, which in reality serves to erode Indigenous governing authority. My research question is, in the case of the Maa-Nulth Final Agreement, how do state strategies of limited recognition manifest, and to what extent does this facilitate economic ordering? The literature falls under the umbrella of settler colonial theory. And when it comes to land claims, the general consensus is that Canada's current framework is one of mutual recognition, which is the reconciliation of Indigenous nationhood and colonial sovereignty by accommodating land and rights claims. Divisions are mainly regarding which theories and areas of analysis best capture the most pressing issues within the CLC framework, and these can be grouped into two general camps. The first is the structural realm, which focuses on legal mechanisms, socio-political structures, and the capitalist superstructure as a whole. The other is the subjective realm, which looks at things like public justifiability theory, legal consciousness theory, and legal pluralism theory. Research connecting both the subjective and structural aspects of the land claims process from a political economy paradigm remains scarce, and it's my hope that my research can make a small contribution to fill that gap in the literature. My theoretical framework combines two existing contemporary theories. The first is Glenn Coulthard's theory of limited recognition. He argues that the state uses a seemingly progressive set of discourses and institutional practices in interacting with the Indigenous population. However, these remain colonial in their foundation. Aboriginal law in Canada maintains this foundation through the asymmetrical exchange of mediated forms of state recognition. Britton Purdy's 2020 Law and Political Economy framework examines how the legal system employs state power, to what ends, and for whose benefit. The most important aspect of this theory from my research is economic ordering, which is the idea that relations of power are legally configured over time and in distinct periods to condition the development of the economy in the interest of the dominant group. I do a case study of the Maa-Nulth Final Agreement in 2011. Obviously, since this is a single study, the results are not generalizable. Rather, it's more so an example of how limited recognition can present in Canada. I begin my analysis by using the academic literature to reconstruct the national and local historical context of the Maa-Nulth First Nations. Next, my data includes federal and provincial CLC policy, jurisprudence that was foundational to the evolution of Aboriginal title, and the final agreement itself. These were analyzed using qualitative coding analysis in vivo. My codebook for this was based on Coulthard's subjective and structural realms of settler colonialism in Canada. And after coding, the different themes were examined to locate the most common patterns of limited recognition, which showed evidence of economic ordering. To locate economic ordering, for the LPE framework, there are two forms of power which indicate the presence of economic ordering for my purposes, and these are political power and constitutive power. Constitutive power is defined as the ubiquitous coercion of economic relations on the basis of unequal bargaining power, and this is the extent to which pre-existing structures and the negotiation process align with the state's goals in such a way that significantly limits the bargaining power of the Maa-Nulth First Nations. The next is political power, which is attributed to actors that legal structures provide channels of influence to within the economic system. In the case of the CLC framework, this would refer to factors which limit a group's ability to have autonomous governance over their land and economic activity. Moving into the discussion, I've divided it into these two power types. First, constitutive, I've got 5 major themes that emerged, and 3 of those are subjective. First, Aboriginal title. The current conception of Aboriginal title contains a limit in that the lands cannot be used in a manner that is irreconcilable with the nature of the claimant's attachment to those lands. This means the group cannot significantly alter the land in a way that would affect future generations' use of it. Due to constrained nature of Aboriginal title, if First Nation groups require additional income, which statistically is usually the case, entering negotiations and acquiring the land as fee simple opens it up to resource extraction and provides more opportunities for economic growth in comparison to acquiring traditional title through litigation. Certainty allows for concrete parameters of rights to be established. In this context, agreements appear to be the safer financial option compared to lengthy and uncertain litigation. Lastly, reconciliation within the context of jurisprudence and policy, in its purest form, considers Indigenous needs proportionally with the general population's needs. It cannot conflict with the general interests of the public. So these factors provide incentive for First Nations to enter agreements, whilst keeping the outcomes of these agreements very limited through public interest discourse. Next is the structural aspects. For land, this is in particular the overlapping land claims that usually arise. A few existing treaties have already granted exclusive treaty settlement land in areas which actually hold competing claims. And this prioritizes private ownership, and it puts pressure on groups to enter claim negotiations as quickly as possible for fear of losing out on land. Next is finances, and in particular debt accruement. Treaties take an average of 8 to 10 years to be resolved, and First Nations must pay their own negotiation fees. To do so, they take out loans from the federal government, and in some cases, the amount of money groups borrow surpasses the amount they would actually receive under the treaty settlement. The high cost of completing an agreement provides an incentive to Indigenous groups to conclude agreements as quickly as possible, which really does limit their bargaining power to a significant extent. Next is political power. I found 6 major themes here. 2 of these are subjective and 4 are structural. Beginning with the subjective, the relationship, the MFA preamble, or the Maa-Nulth Final Agreement preamble, sets up the Crown as the sole recognizing party. Crown sovereignty is assumed. The Maa-Nulth's perspectives and stories are limited to negotiating within this existing narrative of colonial rule, and none of the language indicates the equal consideration of both parties, which establishes a fundamentally imbalanced negotiating perspective. Next is modification clauses. All Aboriginal rights possessed by Indigenous groups are modified to be expressed completely within the agreement, and this diminishes their pre-existing rights to those expressly outlined in an agreement that was already made under pressure. Some actually argue this is a more limited form of establishing rights than the previously severe extinguishment clauses that existed in BC. Next is structural. Land alienability. The Maa-Nulth only hold ownership over Maa-Nulth Treaty Settlement lands, which is 7% of the total land claim. The rest of the land is called traditional lands, which are still owned by the Crown, although the Maa-Nulth may use them for cultural purposes. So it's important to remember that the Maa-Nulth only actually have ownership and governance over a fraction of the land in this claim. Maa-Nulth own subsurface resources under their treaty settlement lands. They have authority to set rent, fees, and royalties. However, they cannot sell resource rights to a third party, and their ownership is subject to existing subsurface tenures, of which there are 10 in their TSL. So this seems to encourage capitalist resource extraction, both by giving the Maa-Nulth full ownership and ensuring existing projects continue. Next is resource revenue sharing. There was a 25-year agreement that is cost shared between Canada and British Columbia based on the actual revenue produced for governments by resource activity. As opposed to increased direct support from governments, revenue sharing makes Aboriginal communities more dependent on rapid resource development to meet their fiscal needs. This, in turn, could make them more reliant on resource companies and more focused on short-term returns than the long-term impact of resource development on their communities and territories. Lastly is jurisdiction. Rather than having a nation-to-nation relationship, the areas of governance in which Maa-Nulth have political autonomy are really comparable to that of a municipal government. This limits the political power of the Maa-Nulth FN because it prevents them from having autonomy over their economy, and correspondingly protects the political power of the Crown by allowing the Crown to continue to form legislation that the Maa-Nulth must uphold through maintaining comparable laws. In conclusion, I find that in the case of the Maa-Nulth Final Agreement, the Crown holds constitutive power during the CLC process through the possibility of state infringement, the financial barriers to entering and continuing negotiations, and the certainty objective acting as a double-edged sword for the Maa-Nulth First Nations. The MFA limits the political power of the Maa-Nulth First Nations by conferring authority, which is equivalent to a municipal-style government, and it encourages capitalist expansion through subsurface resources within their TSL and resource revenue sharing agreements within traditional lands. These findings suggest Canada's current limited recognition framework facilitates economic ordering in favor of the settler colonial capitalist state.